I'm at, that's a fake background. That is a background from one of our offices. Yes,
Great.
in Seattle. But I'm at our place in Sarasota, Florida, which, as of last year, has become our primary residence. Our Boston and our New Hampshire are kind of secondary. We'll be going back to Boston, though, in a few weeks.
If it's possible, of course.
Correct. We're in a period in which one assesses, rethinks, and replans once every 24 hours.
Yeah. It's hitting us all around the globe. So it's impossible not just to mention the COVID-19 crisis just for a brief moment. I don't want to talk the whole hour about Corona, but just when you look at society today, about when you look to American society, what do you see?
Well, it's like nothing that I've witnessed in my lifetime. And that includes the 2008 economic crisis, the 2000-ish tech bust, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the assassinations that so shook the country in the 1960s. I mean, I could go on and on. No, this is more viscerally, behaviorally, economically extreme than any of that. What people don't yet grasp, because they're all, I mean, this is all hit us really in the last month, even though I guess the official outbreak in China allegedly was in December. For all practical purposes, the world here has been turned upside down only since mid-March.
Yeah.
Okay, and it changes every couple of days. There's a new something, and now we're back to, this is the most extreme example in my lifetime of a trend that goes back, forever, but particularly since the Industrial Revolution and then the last 10 or 20 years, which is that the speed of change has just been going up. And all of this is an incremental jump by a factor of, I don't know what, 10 over what we've been seeing before. And what this is exposing is that our modern institutions and organizations, and frankly, just human nature, biology, which was put into place for an environment that's long gone, 100,000 plus years ago, doesn't automatically handle this speed and this amount of uncertainty well at all. But I've just finished a second draft of the next book, which I started writing December with some of my colleagues, December 1st. So this is before the virus. And we had no intention of, that wasn't the motivation. It was just pulling together the latest research. And which is, the argument is that the single biggest force shaping events in this world, even then, was the increasing amount of change that's going on. That human nature is much more oriented toward survival, not innovation to deal with change. Modern organizations, which were basically built, the basic structure over a century ago, are also designed for standardization, efficiency, reliability, not for change. And the whole argument of the book was to go through the various ways that what we've learned so far, because there is almost an emerging science change. What we've learned so far, the gap between what we've learned and kind of managerial business and non-business government practice, and what we've got to do about it. And then while we're writing this, to get hit with this, it was like, whoa.
You have to reconsider your draft. It's. I mean, you have to do an update. I guess.
Oh yeah, we're like mad.
Yeah.
We're circulating it around the firm right now, and working like mad to produce something that is practical, enlightening, helpful.
Mm-hmm.
The most unfortunate outcome. I mean, well, I suppose the most unfortunate outcome always is a lot of people unnecessarily die. I mean, this is very morbid, but there's this a social issue here, which is that we don't take advantage of the learning that can come through this crisis right now, because there are a lot of people that are being forced into, I mean, to take education.
Mm-hmm.
I get at least a couple of long emails every single day from Harvard University or Harvard Business School outlining a million things that are going on as they try to cope with the situation. But there are people who have done no teaching through remote, who are now teaching through remote, and a few of them at least are not just kind of grudgingly doing that, but they're experimenting like mad. They're saying, this has limitations. What are the technological possibilities? It's forcing them to step back and think about education in a more basic way that you don't do when things are working for you, or at least you think they're working for you. And if that kind of crisis-induced or crisis-supported innovation happens enough, and we get a good enough leadership that starts to sustain it after the crisis is over, this could, some very good things. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish optimistic, but some very good things could come out of this. Conversely, I just spoke to a guy the other day who said, a year from now, everybody's going to slide right back into their old routines. There'll be a few little, changes on the margin, and that's it. If that happens, that will be understandable, because the forces that stop us from changing and sustaining major changes for the good are very powerful, like I say,
Mm-hmm.
inside human nature and inside modern organizations. But that would be tragic. Well, how are things right now? They're surreal, with upside possibilities and downside possibilities.
So when I read my two favorite books, because they're fables, this is really my favorite because I really had to laugh a lot. Somehow the tone of voice is way more serious in this book, so I was expecting to cry because I had to laugh so hard. Because a penguin with a suitcase. The idea is, but here it starts. It's way more the sense of urgency is right there, you know, and here the penguins have to grow into the sense of urgency. The thing I want to say is your 8 step change model today in the corona crisis, we are skipping so many steps. I mean, we skip creating a vision. I mean, we skip an alliance. We skip so many parts. So I was wondering, Dr. Kotter, can we apply your 8 step change model backwards as well?
There is, I have no evidence yet that the fundamental patterns that we originally identified and then reported a number of ways, and the follow-up studies and the follow-up reports that went into more and more nuance around what you're calling the 8-step model, that isn't a function of just human nature and large-scale organization. And therefore, it applies at any speed of change. Now, the details we're learning matter, as they always do, and we have, for example, just, I don't know how much you know, about 11 years ago, a ex-Microsoft exec and my wife, who's a Harvard MBA, and I co-founded a consulting company, the point of which was to try to have more impact than we were having through just books and speeches and teaching at Harvard. You know, I mean, that can sound kind of vain and egotistical, but I think the motives were pure. We really decided, why not? Let's try. If we fail, we fail. We can survive that, and that has been growing and growing and growing. And right now, we're working with a client that we initially started working with them. This is a big, well-known company. You'd know them. To help them with a merger with a big acquisition, to make the acquisition integration go faster, smoother, because it requires huge change when you do M&A well. But they, as it turns out, have the capacity to make some things that are very much needed in this crisis. And our people are sliding over, trying to find ways to help them to think in a new way and act in a new way. Because if they use business as usual, they will indeed make some things that we need in this crisis and have it all available for us in 14 months. We need it tomorrow. And one of the things that the consulting firm has learned is if you use some of the principles that are in that 8-step process that we've learned more and more about over the last decade, you can start making things happen, even though, changing culture, for example, has historically taken a long time. It's not an easy, short thing to do. But nevertheless, you can start to have an impact on real results in 90 days, 60 days, 30 days. But it requires not business as usual. It requires, mobilizing not just the normal, small, elite little task force, but getting a lot more people into it, not because they're being ordered, but because their hearts as well as their minds are kind of connected to what you're trying to do. and in which you actually don't try to micromanage things, but you, with clarity of what you're trying to do and what the opportunity is, you can allow them to be proactive, to provide in their own ways leadership. So the total amount of leadership in the organization goes up, which tends to, if it's aligned, correlate with the speed of change. So the point there is that we are living right now, and every day brings something new. Some examples of how assignments that started before the virus are kind of continuing, but they're also morphing off into helping organizations move much faster than they normally would. And it's using the fundamental principles that are, if not explicit, implicit in our little iceberg book.
Yeah, but let's go over these points, because I think I'm just wondering. I'm hoping, especially in education, that we can change some things. Let's get rid of punitive accountability or teacher evaluation that that fires teachers. The thing is, how do we change in a sustainable way? And I was wondering, because this book offers great tools, and the same tools are actually managed in this one in the very end, and of course your most famous book there. So let's go over to the steps. First of all, create a sense of emergency. I mean, uh, companies don't have to create that sense anymore, do they? It's there. The
Well,
sense.
what's happening? You're correct, but in a study that was reported, I think initially in a book called A Sense of Urgency,
Mm-hmm.
what we learned is that we didn't understand it then, because this is before we started doing um, work on what brain scientists is now telling us about human nature. It's possible when things really do speed up, uncertainty goes way up, predictability
Mm-hmm.
goes way down, for people to basically panic. Now, they don't necessarily show it. Good professionals don't show panic. That's bad, but that's what's happening inside. And we call that false urgency. That is to say, It looks like but nobody looks complacent.
Mm-hmm.
They're running around like
Mm-hmm.
mad doing things. But if you look at what they're doing, it's not being very productive in terms of helping the organization change in a better way, and change in a way that ultimately could be sustainable. And what I'm seeing right now is that there are any number of, I can't tell you how many organizations that are going into this kind of false urgency, this kind of hyper activated sense of survival, personal survival. And that's not helping. You want people to be, you don't want people to be complacent, obviously, and crises handled correctly can get people out of complacency, but you don't want them to go into panic, because once that happens, that has a tendency, again, if you understand the way the kind of brain is programmed, it tends to shut down that side of the brain which has the capacity to kind of spot some broader, important, critical issue that is an opportunity, not just a short-term problem, and can sustain energy through kind of positive emotions of caring, for example, about, in education, students and the impact of education on society. That piece of the brain is much newer in evolutionary terms. It's easily overwhelmed when our survival instincts kick in.
Mm-hmm.
And in too many organizations, I just talked to a CEO on a Zoom yesterday, and I'm enormously impressed. He's new in a job, but he was saying, and this isn't the first time I've heard it. He says my people are working incredibly long hours, and I said, and how much are they getting done in terms of in the short term, making the changes that are necessary to protect the people, the employees, the customers themselves, and actually in a meaningful way, learning from this, innovating, and trying to produce an organization that'll come out of this stronger. And he just goes, he says, they're just running from meeting to meeting or from Zoom to Zoom and not doing much
of anything. It's like when Nadia left the colony to find Lena, she met with a couple of other clans who were running around like madmen, didn't know where they were going. Is it that kind of situation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very much like that. And there's a lot of that that's going on right now. And again, people misread it. From the corner office, especially if you're dealing with an organization some size, unlike the guy I talked to yesterday, it's very easy to look down and say, oh, urgency, that's not an issue. Everybody's understands this. This is a crisis. Don't talk to me about that. Well, no, they're not complacent, but they're not in a position to be able to launch off and do the kind of creative and innovative things to make some major changes that will serve you, that are possible in the short term, that will deal with the short-term reality, but will serve you well in the long term because they're in a heightened kind of panic.
Yeah, because we skipped. Here is the model in the book. We skipped building, guiding a coalition. We don't have time for that. We skipped a strategic vision. So that's why I'm asking: can we work backwards as well? Because if we want sustainable change, what happens if the crisis is over in a couple of months and there is no urgency anymore? But we have changed our company in some way. What happens? Does the whole company collapse?
Well, it's going to depend upon the details, obviously. I think some companies will come out of this, and like I said a few minutes ago, as somebody told me last week with a straight face, he thought that in a year from now, it'll be right back to where it was in December. That's going to happen to some places. That will not serve them well, especially if we're still in an economic downturn, a recession or something like that. They need to be stronger, not weaker, having basically survived. I think there will be some places that sadly do actually do some useful things during this period, including keeping their people safe, and doing what they can for the economy and not, tanking their shareholders' pension funds and the like. But that nevertheless will, as soon as they can, the forces of kind of how we do things around here will come back and just overwhelm all of that, and they will increment themselves again back toward closer to where they were, keeping only some minor things. So even the innovations, the crisis form innovations won't hold. But there are going to also be some, and what we don't know at this point is how many. And certainly, there are people like, I suppose, both of us that would be devoted to trying to increase the number that can navigate this not only as a short-term crisis, but as a longer-term sustainable set of changes that push us or help us mobilize and leap in a much better direction for how we run, fill in the blank, car companies, K-12 school systems. It's not as if there aren't some pretty smart people who are running things that recognize that they need more than just a short cut costs for 6 months and then go back to normal. In the book, we quote the chap who's currently running Volkswagen as saying, the automobile industry, the way we've been doing things, it's history. It's history, and the challenge for someone like him, of course, is to know enough about how to mobilize people to make some major things happen that ultimately are sustainable. And we do know quite a lot about that. It just hasn't gotten out there yet enough because there hasn't been as dramatic a need. So back to hope, cross fingers. But what do you think? Let me throw it back at you for education and for what we call K-12, pre-college education. Do you see any signs that this is providing a platform for some people to come forward and actually mobilize folks to take some steps that, if they're smart, will be sustainable over time, that could really change educational systems that are, for all practical purposes, 100, 150 years old and are out of touch, despite the fact that they have some pretty dedicated people in them, out of touch with the times. Do you see anything happening in education that leads you?
Before the crisis, there were more or less two parties: the old school teaching force that really like things the way they are, standardized testing, teaching to the test, and there are forces who are much more against standardized testing, just how do you get formative assessment. And in Holland, when you finish primary school, you are streamed into a certain level. We have vocational level, we have gymnasium, we have something in between. So your IQ decides your future when you're 12 years old. So if you have an IQ of 80, you go to vocational education. You don't have a choice. It's a teacher who decides. Even though we know that IQ doesn't mean that you're not creative or you're not an entrepreneur, or we limit children by streaming. So we have a teacher. We have teachers like me who want to abolish the streaming practices. Just look at the talents of each individual, and that goes beyond language. It goes beyond mathematics. It goes beyond. Last year I interviewed Dr. Robert Sternberg, Maybe you know his name, and he was um, uh, provost at Cornell University, I believe.
Hmm.
And when he was an administrator, he abandoned all SATs, and he said, "When you want to go to Cornell University, you have to write an essay. Let's see what you've got." So he tried to um, level the playing field to make it more honest. And I see that we have camps here in Holland, parties in Holland who want to um, get rid of the streaming, get rid of the standardized testing. And we have, of course, a big part of teachers who want to leave things the way they are. So that's, I think, the status quo in the Netherlands right
Got
now.
it. Got it.
So, and that's why I wrote you a letter, Dr. Kotter, because the people who want to change, and I'm one of them, how do we get sustainable change, and how do we realize what tools do we have as individual teachers to come to get that change going on?
Well, one of the things that we learned, and then we learned the actual research that had been done that supports what we had observed, is that when you're making changes in organizations of any size, a whole school district or a whole nation,
Mm-hmm.
um, the kind of modern organizational form tends to be an elite group on top make a decision. They cascade the communication down. It's put into metrics
Yeah,
and budgets,
sounds like
and
Holland. Sounds like Holland.
everybody, right? And everybody kind of is supposed to march in step. And I found in my earliest studies of the most successful big changes, it never happened that way. It was much more. I mean, if you think of the Iceberg book, the group that led it, first of all, wasn't the leadership team, and they didn't spend 6 months putting together the strategic plan. And some of the heroes in the story were buried in the organization,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody expected or could have predicted that they were coming up with creative ideas that
Fred,
made a difference.
big hero.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And this was originally observed, actually, um, in studies of agriculture, the actual embracing and putting into practice agricultural innovations early in the 20th century. And it became known because somebody saw the pattern and wrote it up as kind of Roger's Law, that the way innovations become actually embraced and sustained is it's not this image of kind of the army marching past the reviewing stand with the guy out front,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody march stepping in place. Um, it would start with some innovative types who just come together and make something happen. And they get good enough results that another group, and we've even got statistics for the size of each of these groups typically, comes along, early adopters, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And you get more people mobilized and more momentum, more results. And over time, you make it after you've got a majority of people kind of into the game in a positive way, you start to pull in the late adopters and ultimately the laggards, the people that have, at first, if you try to work on them, it's hopeless. As a matter of fact, all you do is you activate them to fight you. So the trick in these, I suspect, in having watched centralized efforts to try to change education in the United States that have come out of Washington, it's hard to find. I mean, we're a lot of effort and money, and we're still in the same model, if not moved to a worse model.
Yeah. I mean, Diane Ravitch, I interviewed her last year. You know Diane Ravitch from New York University, and she talks about business who's influencing education, charter schools, and such alike, and that the Trump administration wants to privatize education, for example. So when we move to American education, and when we move to urgency, what do you see?
Well, see, a challenge, one of the things that the economists really did get right from my own work is that if you can imagine a continuum that goes from zero competition to kind of infinite competition, where things tend to work out best for society is somewhere in the middle. The problem with monopolies is they easily, even if they're staffed by enormously dedicated people, there are these kind of invisible forces in the organization and also in human nature that lean toward complacency. And the problem with infinite competition, of course, the extreme there is war, is it's just a bloodbath. I mean, you don't get positive change. You just destroy a lot of stuff. And the probability that we will privatize K-12 education in the United States, I think, is zero. It's not going to happen, no matter who pushes for it. There are too many people who understand something about the importance of public education, the way the U.S. uses the word, not the way the British use the word. The hope with allowing for some of these non-public, either originally they were mostly Catholic schools, run by nuns, or some of the charter schools and the like, was that they would be able to innovate. The innovation would slide into the public system, and it would all be wonderful. That has not happened. You can find some charter schools who've done some pretty remarkable things because they attracted some dedicated teachers and they gave them a lot of rope. They didn't say you must A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. But in terms of that being able to grow or influence public schools, again, the model that people are using still is very much a legislate at the city, state, mostly state or national level. And there are certain kinds of changes that you can legislate. You can set up, as FDR did, Roosevelt did in the 1930s, something called Social Security through legislation in Washington. You have to fight to get enough votes to do it. But most things require, for them to work, individuals to actually do things differently, think differently, have a supporting culture around them that are different. And legislation doesn't have a good record at being able to do that. And it certainly doesn't fit the model that we've seen of, get a real sense of urgency, put together the right guiding coalition, which is a diverse group by level and by kind of subunit department. Get some clarity around what the vision of the opportunity and how we can exploit it, and ultimately empower people to, within that construct, which they've absorbed because you communicated it correctly into their heads and their hearts, allow them to actually provide in their localized space some leadership.
If you look with your professional lens to the U.S. government and look at the way they're handling the crisis from a change management point of view, how are they doing?
The governments before we got hit with this latest crisis, I'm tempted to say without exception, across the globe, have evolved into big kind of political, bureaucratic bureaucracies that don't change very quickly or very smartly. And this is making many more demands on them. So the answer, I'm sure, when we debrief this in some detail, a year or 2 years or 10 years from now, we will be able to come up with lots of people to criticize, lots of governments to criticize. I would come back and say this was inevitable. They weren't. I mean, if somebody can't drive a car at 40 miles an hour, it's just too much for them. They're and you suddenly they're put into a race where they have to drive 100 miles an hour. To expect anything except for some crashes, some bodies, and some difficult situations, surreal situations, is to be out of touch with reality. So I guess the answer to the question is no, they're not handling it well. And it's predictable they're not handling it well. I mean, if they can't handle even less, I mean, the world has always had, at any one time in the last, just the last decade, there are crises all over the world. Some of us believe, for example, to take the particular topic that you're interested in, that K-12 education in the United States, which I know more about than, for example, the Netherlands, is in a crisis state. And we weren't handling that well.
Even before COVID-19.
And now, you got layers of more fast-moving, uncertain, and of course, they didn't handle what looks like good times and kind of slow movement back in November well. Why would we expect them to be handling the mess that we're in right now well? I mean, if I had my hope again is that there are enough people that are absorbing the bigger lessons here, that particularly have to do with a more rapidly changing world. And there are enough people that are not underneath somebody's thumb that have a little bit of elbow room to experiment and innovate, possibly because the powers that be are so distracted with a million other things, that we will, and there are enough people that are trying to learn from this, that we can get some momentum at handling change better in all sectors as a result of this mess.
What do you hope
Is
to
that
see?
guaranteed? Hardly.
What is an outcome you would like to see? What are you hoping for that society learns from this crisis?
That the that right now we are in a period in which human hardwiring, if you will, and the basic nature of the organizations we built over the last century and a half are able to kind of drive society at 30 miles an hour. And even before the this huge health crisis, in more and more industries and more sectors of society, they were moving at 60 or 90.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have a society or a set of government institutions, a private institution driving at 30 in a world that's moving at 60 and expect anything except bad outcomes over the long term. And if people could get that and therefore start looking for, all right, what are the implications of that? What are the implications of what of the nature of people and where they kind of slide into panic that kills innovation, and what can you do about it? And what is it about modern organizations that throw up barriers to change so easily, quite independent of personalities, just because of the very nature of metrics. I mean, that relates to we're in love, right? The elites are in love with big data right now. Okay, and what they're and for sure, one can find stories of where somebody has collected a lot of information on something, put some AI algorithm on it, and found an insight that's actually useful for people, for customers, for students, for doctors. But even more so than that, when you flood the world with all of this data, it confuses. It carries negative messages or the possibility of anxiety-producing messages, and it easily sends people into this kind of hyper survival state and kills innovation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's your, within education, is obsession with quantity, not just testing, but testing we could reduce down to numbers, which of course produce anxiety in the system for teachers and for students. And that's not, again, given human nature, that isn't putting them in the frame of mind that allows them to learn something about the most important thing that we all need to learn about, which is living in a faster moving world, which means for individuals, it's innovation. It's constant coming up with, it's being able to think broadly. It's being able to act on that, mobilize others to get engaged and to make things happen.
I want to make one remark. When I listen to your presentations, your talks, you always talk about the faster moving world, and you're not really explicit in what that means. So it can be quite annoying when people in general refer to it without knowing what they mean. So I would like to ask you, Dr. Kotter, what does it mean, a faster moving world? What is moving faster?
Okay. It's the amount of change that is happening per unit of time, like per year or per month, has been going up. So pick anything. Let's say data flow across countries in this world, data coming from any source. It's just information that is going from Sarasota to the Netherlands and every other connection. If you can measure that and then graph it for the last 1,000 years, you will end up with an exponential graph. And in the last decade, I mean, it's taken a kick up, and this coronavirus is even another one, because despite the fact that people cannot pass on information face to face because they're climbing on planes and going to conferences, the amount of this stuff that's going on right now has exploded. So it's in business. It's the amount of, for example, M&A activity. If you graph that on an international basis or on a national basis and go back at least 50 years, you don't get a smooth curve. It bounces around, but you put a line through it, and on average, because every one of those transactions creates the need for a lot of change. You acquire something. It's not a matter of you just fold it and put it in your closet. And, it's just.
I'm just because Henry Munzberg, for example, he mentioned the fact that if you're a manager, you always say at the start of a meeting or presentation, we have to change because the world is moving faster and faster. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, it means something if you know what you're talking about, but don't come up with all these gibberish if you don't. I mean, it's become a managerial trick to say the world is moving faster and faster. That's why I'm asking you, because I hear this all the time in my school. But nobody is being explicit. Is it technology? Is it data? Is it nature outside? What is it?
Correct. There are many forces behind this. The two biggest, though, are technology and global integration. We come back and back and back to that. The amount of my son works for Amazon, and he's right now fighting 14 hours a day the battle of their third party suppliers, stopping them from basically price gouging, which if you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of suppliers, good luck with that. And you can't do it with individuals looking at individual cases. It's got to be done with software. And coping with the fact that the lawyers are leaning on him, with saying, watch out, if you do this, it might violate this law. And the people on top saying we can't allow, it's just bad for the company and everybody to allow any of these third-party sellers to be taking advantage of the current situation. But he lives in a technological world where if you look for measures of how much has changed, how much is new that is actually available and being used in the kind of big data AI world in the last 12 months, and compare it to 10 years ago, and compare it to 20 years ago, and compare it to 30 years ago, you're going to see like this. So technology is huge, but global integration, even though it seems like right now we're taking a step back, and we may, with who knows what's going to happen with politics and tariffs and everything else. But the forces behind global integration have been pushing for more interaction, more data flows, more human interaction
but that's what
for centuries, and it's just going up and up and up.
Yeah. But I mean, you know what you're talking about. Obviously, I was not doubting for the tiniest bit. The thing is that people are not being explicit when they talk about the world is faster, changing faster and faster. Because when I look outside, the trees are still green, the buildings are still in the same place. My room is still a mess. It doesn't change. The world is standing still.
No. You put your feet on. Sorry.
No problem.
There we go. You put your finger on a very important issue. That in terms of the human's capacity and the senses we have, eyes, ears, nose, touch. As I look around here right now, if I look around, I don't think there's a sign of anything that I see that would have been different than a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we are much more influenced by our senses than we think. But we know, but my brain does know that, of course, a lot has changed in the last 4 weeks. And this is where what we have found on the consulting side is when working with organizations, you do need to, and I guess this is your point, you need to get them to talk more explicitly about what in their context specifically has been changing, and not just in the last month,
Exactly.
but let's take a sweep. You guys, the oldest person here in the room is joined the company 40 years ago. All right. What was it like then? How often? What was the life cycle of a typical product back then? How often in the factories did you have to retool things with new equipment? And let's take it up concretely, because you're right. If people don't appreciate in some detail what is changing around them, they're never going to be able to see where the problems are and where the opportunities are. And they'll never be able to generate enough internal energy and commitment and belief to be able to follow through and do something about it. It'll just be words that won't motivate them to intelligent action.
That might just be the reason, Dr. Kotter, why education in many schools, if you look inside the classroom, the way there's being taught, it's still the same as a century ago. I mean, we have a computer in a classroom, but the essence of teaching is I'm the boss. I'm going to tell you the empty vessel. I'm going to fill it with your knowledge. So the sense of urgency to change, to tell to teachers what has changed in your teaching practice, well, not an awful lot, actually. So why would we change? I mean, it's changing really slowly, education from the inside.
Right. And where we started to say desperately, where we certainly need more leadership, not just from a couple of high-level government officials, but from superintendents, principals, teachers, brand new 21-year-old teachers, everybody. And this is another thing that people have trouble grasping. There were people still think of leadership as a limited group of folks,
individuals
who kind of individuals who sit at the top of hierarchies, and they don't think of it as a process that can be activated by and helped by people about anywhere. And indeed, in all the great change stories, just like the Iceberg book, for example, there are always the unusual suspects, we sometimes call them, who, if you create the right conditions, will emerge and come up with something that is, and make something happen that is quite brilliant. Bureaucracies throw up barriers against that constantly. And hence we're back to the need to change bureaucracies. Have you read my Accelerate book?
No, just these three: the meerkats, the iceberg, and leadership.
Okay, it's not a fable, so it doesn't have that fun kind of aspect to it. But it spells out what we've learned and what we've tested and what we do today, in terms of putting together a kind of an organizational form that can both handle short-term efficiency and reliability questions that bureaucracies, when they're run well, can do a pretty good job at, but yet can also change and innovate. And I describe a kind of a dual operating system, I call it, in that book. It might be, not that you've got a lot of time on your hands, but if you're, it might be worth at least glancing at it.
Mm-hmm. Let me round up because you've been really generous with your time. The last few questions are about you, your future. And there was just one thing when you mentioned the Corona crisis and its impact. You said it was even worse than the Vietnam War. Next week, Tuesday, I'm interviewing Noam Chomsky. His work, of course, and he will tell you that there are two more important crises going on as we speak: climate and the risk of atomic war, especially with your current president. Why didn't you mention climate? Why is climate not something that comes to mind when we talk about really disastrous crisis?
No. In terms of the number of crises going on around the world, including some genocides that are always somewhere going on, including some malnutrition and starvation crises because of bad weather. Certainly, in a big picture sense, the whole climate thing. China, I've been calling for 15 years now the biggest stakes high wire act without a net that humanity's ever seen. And if they blow it, it'll affect all of us. I mean, it's easy to mention. There are lots of crises, and trying to rate them, which is worse, is not my specialty.
I don't want to say I don't want to rate any crisis because genocide and hunger are terrible. The thing is, climate is endangering human existence. If I have to believe Noam Chomsky and some worldwide organizations, somehow people around me are not worried at all about this crisis. Maybe because it's not affecting them right now. But it's going to affect some people. If we start up the factories again someday, the ice caps are melting, and it's not only this iceberg that's melting, but the whole Arctic region is going to melt. Why are we so relaxed and laid back when it comes to climate?
Okay. Complacency around climate issues, despite the fact that some people have been trying to eliminate complacency and create a sense of urgency for 20 years now. Complacency is astonishingly high. That is got to be, to some degree at least, not only a function of just the fact that our hardwiring tends to look for immediate threats.
Yeah.
That's part of it. And our organizations have a heck of a time thinking long term. They work on, yearly budgets at best. Mm-hmm. But it's also a function. You have to question how the people who most clearly see the climate crisis, how they've been going about trying to increase the sense of urgency and reduce complacency, because they're failing. And the question I would have is, why are they failing? What is their basic strategy? We know from corporate research that credibility and trust in people who are bringing problems and opportunities to larger groups is incredibly important. And that anything that reduces your credibility or creates distrust really limits your effectiveness. And as an observer, not an expert, I pick up the newspaper, for 20 years now, and every once in a while find myself just kind of going like this because some story that's come out of some scientist who allegedly, sent these emails to another scientist, and it all sounds like it's a political game and they're not being real scientists. I mean, those are killers. Shouting louder than the old crying wolf. You can get away with it 3 times, then nobody pays any attention to you. That's the climate people. The Iceberg book is a perfect example of what the climate people need to be doing. And if you reread the beginning of that and look at what the Fred did with the leadership team, which is incredibly clever, and how he helped them to kind of see it, feel it, to the point where they were willing to take it the next step.
With the empty bottle and the mini iceberg.
Yeah. And with total sincerity, no games. I mean, it was too many climate people do not have the trust and believability among the masses, and they can point to the masses and say these people are all idiots, but they ought to be looking in a mirror and trying to improve their own approach. And I don't mean that as a criticism. This is tough stuff.
Just from a professional stance. I see what you mean. Well, my last question is about you. If you have to describe yourself in 3 books, 3 dishes, and 3 musical pieces, what kind of John Kotter would we see? What 3 books have defined you as a person or were really important for you?
Good heavens. After you've read enough books, it's hard to imagine. Certainly, something from Freud, like the interpretation of dreams, I'm sure helped me to see human beings in a more complex way, and that the mere notion of the unconscious, it has so vast implications that it's even affecting my current work. I suspect and these are all going to be older books, not anything new. I'm sure when I first, many years ago, fought my way through Newton's Principia,
wow,
I was blown away that somebody at that time could invent, if you will, a way of looking at the world that had some was getting more and more empirical proof back that he was onto something. It says something about what humans are capable of. And a third one, I don't know. I suppose the origin of the species. Yeah, because I have increasingly, I've always thought in more historical terms than my colleagues who are very cross-sectional. They research, what happened yesterday, correlating with today, and don't pay attention to all the forces that have been building up for 10 or a century or a millennium. But Darwin, it's not only the ideas, but to go to, away from England on a creaky ship back when he did. Wow. Another kind of awesome story. And I'll finish with a more contemporary one. Fourth one would be, I think, Mandela's Autobiography is an astonishing book. How much it tells the details of what really happened accurately, I don't know, because I didn't live there and didn't have access to him. But it for sure tells us something about the psychology, if you will, the way of thinking of arguably one of the two or three most astonishing leaders of his era. Yeah. Again, very uplifting for me. So there are four books.
That's books and music. Who is Dr. Kotter in music?
Oh Lord, my wife and I now, for the last year or so, ever since we got Alexa, we've been playing music over dinner. And occasionally, when it's dark outside with candle lights, I'm finding we're playing a lot of music that we first encountered when we were young. And I love a colleague of mine had 5 or 6 of us send an email to 5 or 6 of us and a few months ago and said, what are some songs that inspire you the most? And he put together a soundtrack with, I don't know, 20 kind of inspiring songs, all the way from Handel and Haydn's, Messiah, down classical to the Beach Boys, Carl's ode that Paul McCartney liked so much, the name of which I'm blanking right now. So inspirational music of any genre, I certainly love.
But you have a really broad taste, from Haydn to the Beach Boys to the Beatles.
Oh yeah. And my wife grew up in the South, so we were listening to classic country.
Beautiful.
The other day, and last night or 2 nights ago, for the entire time, like 10 Barbara Streisand songs.
Great. You're right there at that moment. I can see it. So, and when you're having a candlelight dinner, what's for dinner? What do you like?
Well, tasty, healthy stuff. I'm big on vegetables, huge on vegetables, and I like healthy, low fat, low sugar, and not because so much because there's something in my head that says, is wagging a finger at me. It's because my wife has managed, even though she's, she ran a company for a while. She's a professional. She can cook some things that are enormously tasty and healthy. That's what I.
So it's the wife that cooks. The Dr. Kotter doesn't cook.
I'm always there to assist, which means I get
you cut the vegetables.
The low skilled jobs, which is usually cutting. But I set the table, right. and we share cleanup.
I always ask my interviewees who inspires you and who should I interview next. So if you think about a person still alive, preferably, that really got your interest, that I should interview, for example.
Well, I know who I'd love you to interview. I suspect it's going to be really tough to get to him. In the business world today, the most interesting character, I think, is Elon Musk.
Yeah.
All right. He's quirky. He does some odd things. But my Lord, we have a Tesla down here in Sarasota, an S, which is the most remarkable car I've ever driven. And I've driven cars that cost 5 times as much. And this is, one piece of his little turn us into an interplanetary species, and solar, and the boring machine, and it could all blow up, but it is the most astonishing business story right now. I would love to spend a day with Elon.
Let me see what I can do. Well, let me end this conversation by thanking you a million. You've been really generous with your time. And let's hope we can change education and even society for the better. Not just with good ideas, but also by using these principles. So I would like to thank you for writing these books. Keep writing, and thanks for your time.
My pleasure. And you keep up doing what you're doing, my friend. Really. Yeah. And don't get discouraged, even though I'm sure there are times when it's pretty discouraging. You're making a difference, okay?
Thank you, Dr. Kotter. Have a good day, and see you next time.
Okay, you have a good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.